Today I'd like to show you how I made my October tag. It's part of my 12 tags of 2012 and features this month's flower, which is calendula. We'll be using alcohol inks, archival inks, pigment inks, a little bit of acrylic paint, a little bit of blending solution and an eyelet, and making good use of chemistry of the different inks, which I'll explain as we go through. Firstly, we're going to use the alcohol inks to decorate the background. I have a piece of glossy card designed for alcohol ink application here. Ranger does a good range. You can also get a good glossy card from Woodware. I have my ink applicator tool with a felt pad, and I'm using lettuce and caramel alcohol inks. First of all, put a small squirt of the lettuce, and next to it a squirt of the caramel. And I like to work sideways. And the main thing is to remember to dab on, twist, dab on, twist, dab on, and keep moving the ink around by twisting the tool, and that way you get a good varied pattern. Don't worry about going over the top of where you've been before. The inks blend and the glossy card helps this. As the ink on the pad starts wearing out, I'm moving across, because I want a graded appearance, and now it's running out even further. I'm going to start pressing a bit harder, and you'll notice that we get a good mottling effect. That's because of the pressure of the hook and eye, the velcro, through the felt pad. So I'm now going over bits that have dried, and we get that lovely shading and blending going on. And as the pads got very dry, I'm now going to add a small amount of blending solution, because what we can then do is go back over it, and it sort of bleaches it back a little bit, as well as helping it to blend. So that's where we're up to. And you can see a dark full area at the bottom and a slightly more mottled area and whiter at the top. Next, and using the same pad, I'm going to add some pesto and some well shaken gold metallic. The pesto's a darker green, and similarly I'm going to put quite a good generous dollop and equivalent of a couple of dots of the gold. Again, I'm going to start from the bottom and keep dabbing and twisting as I go, and you can see the gold is starting to give a nice sheen, and we can still see some of the first colours through the pesto and the gold down at the bottom. Again, I'm wanting a lighter touch at the top, so working fairly lightly just to get a few dabs of the colour in rather than a solid shade. As before, I'll go over what I've done before just to blend it in that little bit more. And once more, I'm going to sort of reactivate some of the inks with the blending solution. Just fill in those white spaces and the gold is more or less completely covering the area. We still have a lighter bit at the top and darker down at the bottom. Finally, just to add some interest, I'm going to just dab spots direct from the bottle of blending solution, and this does the equivalent of water on distress inks. It pushes the colour away, dilutes it, bleaches it out somewhat unpredictably, and if you want to stop the whole thing in its tracks, just heat to evaporate the alcohol away. So there we have it. That's our background for the image. If I take that away, I'll give you a top tip for cleanup. Don't waste your blending solution. I've got some alcohol-based hand sanitizer, and I'm just going to squirt some dollops of that over. I've got a dry baby wipe. As you can see, that's cleaned the alcohol inks beautifully. Now going in with a wet baby wipe to get rid of all the moisturisers and the conditioners. And finally, I'll just give it a quick clean wipe over to dry with kitchen roll. Next we're going to start work on the flowers, and I've got this daisy punch, and it's 160 GSM thin card, and I've just punched that out, as you will have heard. That's going to be our stencil. The next thing I did was to try acrylic inks, and these are relatively cheap acrylic ink, and I mixed 2/3 yellow with a dollop of Vermillion, and I'm using a plastic palette knife just to squidge those together to get a good orange colour. Now, for those that don't know, acrylic paints are water-based, and they are a carrier with a pigment similar to the inks we use when we're stamping. And you can get various different grades of acrylic paint, the best ones being fairly expensive, and these cheaper ones being relatively inexpensive. But the problem is, as I'll show you on this piece of paper, the cheaper ones have less pigment. So when you put a layer on, they sometimes aren't very opaque. So they act more like a dye ink than an opaque pigment ink. So demonstrating that on our background, here we go. I'm going to use a makeup face painting sponge. Place the stencil over, load the sponge with the paint, and then I'm going to dab it through. Now this sponge was well loaded, and you can see that from the effect on the white paper, but when I remove the stencil and show you the effect on the background, it's not that brilliant. However, what this is doing is sealing the glossy card underneath, and we will see the benefits of that shortly. Just going to dry that off so I don't smudge it with the next flower. And you know it's dry because it goes matte and slightly darker. Repaint up the sponge, reload the sponge with paint. Dab again, take that off, dry once more. There we go. And finally, one more at the bottom. There we go. So that acrylic paint is now waterproof and sealing the alcohol ink layer below. Another top tip, when you're finished painting up your area, then don't waste the paint, dab it round your stencil. And then dry the stencil off. There we go. Now the reason I've done that is because we now have a waterproof stencil that should help stop the oil-based archival ink soaking through when we use this stencil again. I'm now going to clean up and just wash out the sponge with the paint still wet under running water. The next section I'm going to use the Monarch Orange archival ink, which is the permanent, it's sort of an oil-based waterproof ink, and I'm using the stencil we prepared earlier. So I'm going to line it up with the acrylic paint layer, and then using the pad directly to the tag, I'm going to press and smooth the ink through the stencil onto that acrylic paint layer. There we go, there's a bit of smudging under the edges, but you can see there's no soak through from the pad, the ink, because of that acrylic layer. So I'm just going to dry that off briefly with a heat tool so I don't smudge it when it comes to the next one. I'm going to put the interleaf petals on now, so overlay your stencil to cover the ones you've just done, and we'll see what a difference that acrylic layer has made, because this will now soak in and react slightly with the alcohol inks. Because that waterproof acrylic layer isn't there. You'll notice the centre's nice and dark, and those are quite light in comparison because of them working into the ink. And you can see that the paint layer is darker and the non-painted layer is lighter, and that's how I've ended up with the dimensional element. Finally, I'm going to punch another stencil. This one's a 1/2 inch diameter round, and using the Sepia archival ink, I'm just going to put the stencil over the centre of the flower and dab on the sepia. That just darkens it a little bit more. Dry it off. And finally, for this flower, I'm going to add a little bit more just to shade one side. Now bear in mind, all these layers take a little time to dry. They will dry, but try not to smudge it or place it face down just at the moment. So I'll carry on and finish the other two flowers. So just one final thing to note, if we compare the tops of each of our stencils, you can see they're well inked. If we turn them over, you can see what a difference the waterproofing with the acrylic paint makes because of the soak through around this round hole compared to minimal soak through round the daisy. This soak through will eventually tarnish your background, so I do recommend waterproofing. I did try and punch through acetate, but it wasn't going to happen. Next, I want to add the October text. I'm using the series from Personal Impressions, and has the month in a nice handwritten font. And for this we could use something like the Stays On opaque cotton white, but that's likely to interact with the alcohol ink below because the carrier, the solvent, is the same, both alcohol. So instead I'm using a fast drying pigment ink. This is Brilliant's Moonlight White, and I'm going to ink up the clear stamp. Now pigment ink will be opaque, so will show up nicely against the alcohol ink. Going to place another one just above. And then offset one in between. And of course you could do this with Happy Birthday or any other text. I'm now going to mask an area just with corner of some clean card, just to put the end of the word in. And you can probably see fingerprints coming from the ink because I'm rushing, so it is a timely reminder that these archival inks take some time to dry. We're entering the finishing stages now, so I'm going to mount it on a tag. This is a size 6 luggage tag, and to protect the surface I'm going to work on a piece of kitchen towel. Just going to run some very narrow double-sided tape around the edges of the tag, and I'm breaking it off with a thumbnail so that I don't gum up my scissors with the adhesive. I find using some fine tooth tweezers excellent for picking off the backing. There we go, and I'm going to lay that onto my alcohol ink tag, and you can see that some of the ink has come off. So I'll now cut that to size using the tag as my template. And finally I'm going to replace the hole in the tag, so I'm going to turn it upside down and using the 3/16 hole punch on my crocodile, I'm going to line it up with the hole, punch it through, and then I'm going to set an eyelet in place just to finish the whole thing off. Make sure it's the right way round, and crunch and squeeze, and there is my finished tag for October, part of my 12 tags for 2012.